There's a conversation happening right now that almost nobody outside of certain circles is talking about. It's not on the news, it's not trending on social media. It's happening at kitchen tables, on private land, in small towns with no stoplights and one gas station that still has a hand pump out back. Veterans, men and women who spent years training for the worst, are quietly, methodically relocating. Not randomly, not out of paranoia, out of calculation. They are reading the same infrastructure reports that FEMA quietly buried in footnotes. They are looking at the same grid vulnerability assessments that utility executives discuss behind closed doors. And they are voting with their boots, moving to places that don't just survive a grid-down event, they barely notice one. Here's what you need to understand before we go anywhere. The American power grid is not one thing. It's three interconnected systems: the Eastern interconnection, the Western interconnection, and the Texas interconnection. And each of them is aging at a rate that should genuinely alarm you. The average age of a large power transformer in the United States is over 40 years. These are the backbone units, the ones that if they fail can take 18 months to replace because they're custom built, often overseas, and there are no spares sitting in a warehouse. A leaked FERC assessment concluded that a coordinated attack on just 9 critical substations could knock out power across the country for 18 months or more. Not days. Months. When you truly sit with that number, 18 months, it stops being a hypothetical and starts being a planning problem. The veterans who are moving aren't running from something, they're moving toward something. They're applying the same threat assessment logic they use in deployment. You look at the terrain, you look at the population density, you look at the water, the food production capability, the community cohesion, and the defensibility of the position. And when you run those calculations against a grid-down scenario, 9 states keep rising to the top. Not because they're perfect, every single one of them has trade-offs that will hurt the unprepared, because they're fortresses. Idaho is first, and it's first for reasons that compound on each other. The population sits at just over 2 million, still less than many individual American cities. Spread that across 83,000 square miles of high desert, river valleys, and mountain terrain, and you have one of the lowest human-to-land ratios in the continental United States. In a grid-down event, density is danger. Every additional person in a disrupted area is another mouth competing for the same limited resources, another potential vector for civil unrest, another variable you can't control. Idaho removes that problem almost entirely. But low density alone doesn't make a fortress. What makes Idaho genuinely exceptional is the Snake River Plain, one of the most productive agricultural corridors in the country, fed by an aquifer system that doesn't care whether the lights are on. The Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer is massive, ancient, and rechargeable. Irrigation infrastructure in Idaho is largely gravity-fed or pump-dependent at a scale where small generators and solar setups can keep a farm operational when the grid is gone. The trade-offs are real. Medical access in rural counties is thin, and the growing season at elevation is shorter than the agricultural reputation suggests. Veterans who've landed in places like Twin Falls or Bonners Ferry know this and plan around it. They're not buying convenience, they're buying water independence. And in a collapse scenario, water independence is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. Montana operates on a different kind of scale. The entire state has fewer than 1.5 million residents, and its geography does something that no amount of stored food or ammunition can replicate. It makes mass movement difficult by design. The Rocky Mountain Front, the Bitterroot Valley, the hundreds of miles of river-fed wilderness, these aren't just beautiful, they're natural choke points. You cannot mass move through Montana's terrain without being seen, slowed, or stopped by geography itself. The Missouri River headwaters run through here, clean, cold, continuous water that doesn't require treatment infrastructure. Veterans who understand the tactical value of elevated terrain and defensible positions have been buying property in the Bitterroot and Flathead valleys for over a decade. The community networks already established there, centered around ranching culture, firearm proficiency, and deep mutual aid traditions, mean that when outside systems fail, the internal system has already been running for generations. The honest downside, Montana winters are serious. 6 months of cold that laughs at city gear, roads that close without warning, and isolation that becomes genuinely dangerous if your medical situation deteriorates. The veterans who've moved there are not ignoring this. They are specifically selecting for it. The cold is part of the filter. Wyoming is the least populated state in the entire country. Fewer than 600,000 people across nearly 98,000 square miles. And that single fact deserves a moment of silence before anything else is said. In grid-down math, Wyoming is essentially a sovereign nation with almost no population pressure. Think about what it means to have fewer people in an entire state than most mid-sized American cities. Every resource calculus, water, food, fuel, security, changes completely when the denominator is that small. The wind energy infrastructure across the state's eastern plains is significant. Wyoming produces more energy than it consumes under normal conditions, which means off-grid and microgrid solutions are more technically mature than almost anywhere else in the country. The Powder River Basin has coal, natural gas, and the kind of resource density that makes long-term energy independence achievable at a community scale. The cultural baseline is deeply self-reliant in ways that go beyond political posture. It's practical, inherited, and tested by weather that doesn't negotiate. Beyond the cold, the real limiting factor is this: Wyoming rewards people who arrive with a complete plan and punishes those who come with a fantasy. Limited healthcare, a thin economy, and brutal winters mean that your margin for error is essentially zero. That's not a deterrent for the people moving there. It's a feature. Tennessee earns its place on this list not through emptiness, but through geography and water. The Appalachian Mountains run along the eastern spine of the state like a natural fortress wall. These are complex ridge and valley terrain systems that have historically slowed and stopped movement in ways that flat state residents genuinely underestimate. The Cumberland Plateau creates a second tier of defensibility. Threading through it all is the Tennessee River System, one of the most productive freshwater networks in North America. The Tennessee Valley Authority's dam and reservoir network means that even in degraded grid conditions, gravity-fed water flow from elevated reservoirs is possible at local scales. The agricultural capacity of the Tennessee Valley is substantial. The climate is genuinely mild compared to the northern mountain states, and the cultural baseline of self-reliance in East Tennessee communities runs deep, predating the United States itself. Homesteading traditions here were never fully replaced by suburban dependency because the terrain never quite allowed it. The trade-off is population density in the western part of the state. Memphis and Nashville represent exactly the kind of concentrated pressure points that radiate outward in a collapse. Veterans settling in Tennessee are specifically choosing the eastern mountains, not the state as a whole. The zip code matters here more than the state line. West Virginia sounds like a hard sell until you understand what terrain actually does for you when civilization destabilizes. Its mountains and hollows have created isolated and self-sufficient communities for centuries. In a grid-down event, the same geography that made West Virginia economically marginalized in a connected world becomes a profound strategic advantage in a disconnected one. The roads are narrow, winding, and easily controlled. The valleys are hidden. The communities are tight. And the people have not forgotten how to source their own food, their own water, or their own heat, because poverty, paradoxically, is a form of preparedness. A community that never fully electrified its heating or cooking infrastructure doesn't lose those systems in a blackout. West Virginia also sits directly on the Marcellus Shale, one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. Communities positioned near wellheads with existing infrastructure can continue to access heat and cooking fuel long after urban areas have descended into crisis. The honest limitation here is economic. The state has real infrastructure deficits that compound during a long-term grid failure. Roads that are already poor become impassable. Medical facilities that are already stretched become overwhelmed.
The communities that do function here function very well. It's just a narrower margin than the wide-open western states, and you need to know exactly where you're landing before you arrive. The Missouri Ozarks get criminally overlooked, and the reason is simple. They don't look dramatic enough. No massive mountains, no glacier-fed rivers, nothing that photographs impressively. What the Ozark Plateau has instead is something that survival planners consider more valuable than scenery: water that comes from underground. The Ozarks sit on about 50,000 square miles of karst limestone terrain, riddled with springs, caves, and aquifer systems. The water doesn't come from surface reservoirs, vulnerable to contamination or disruption. It emerges cold and clean from springs that have been running continuously for longer than any nation in human memory, filtered through limestone for thousands of years. That kind of water independence changes every other calculation you make. The Ozark region's population density is extremely low, and its farming culture focuses on small-scale diversified production, the opposite of large monoculture agriculture that collapses cleanly when diesel supply chains fail. Veterans who've settled in the Missouri Ozarks describe the same thing repeatedly. The communities were already operating with a grid-down mindset before anyone told them to. The question of how to source food, water, and heat without modern infrastructure is answered here not by theory, but by living tradition. The trade-off, worth naming plainly: limited economic opportunity and some of the most underserved rural healthcare in the country. In a long-term scenario, that becomes a serious planning variable, not a minor inconvenience. Alaska is the most extreme entry on this list, and it earns that distinction honestly, not because it's the most dramatic choice, but because it's the only state where grid-down survival isn't a hypothetical. It is the ongoing baseline condition for most of the population. Rural Alaska has always existed outside the American electrical infrastructure. Communities in the bush run on diesel generators, wood heat, and subsistence hunting and fishing that produces genuine caloric independence at a scale no continental state can match. A single moose provides roughly 600 to 700 pounds of lean protein. Salmon runs in major Alaskan river systems produce hundreds of millions of fish annually. The sea mammal populations along the coast represent food calories on a scale that defies easy description. But here's where the honest downside becomes non-negotiable. Alaska is the hardest possible environment for someone who arrives without the right knowledge base. Supply chains that are already fragile in normal conditions don't just stretch in a collapse, they disappear. Medical evacuation that's already difficult becomes impossible. Alaska doesn't punish unpreparedness with discomfort. It punishes it with finality. Veterans with cold weather training and wilderness medicine backgrounds are the specific population for whom Alaska makes sense. For everyone else, it's a place you need to arrive already knowing, not a place you go to learn. Vermont is the entry that surprises people. And good, the surprise is the point. Vermont is small, northeastern, not dramatic, and not the obvious fortress. What it has instead is something that only reveals its value when you think carefully about what actually determines survival in a long-term grid-down scenario. Vermont has the highest density of small-scale diversified farms per capita in the country. It has an extremely strong local food culture and infrastructure: farmers markets, food co-ops, community-supported agriculture networks built in conscious opposition to supply chain dependency. Its communities have extraordinarily high social cohesion by American standards. The Green Mountains provide terrain buffer. The state has a culture of radical self-governance and localism that traces back before the revolution. When you look at what survives in a grid-down world, it's not always the places with the most dramatic resources. Sometimes it's the places where people already know and trust their neighbors well enough to coordinate without external authority. Vermont's greatest survival asset isn't a river or a mountain. It's the fact that its communities were never fully outsourced to systems they couldn't see or control. The trade-off is a demanding growing season that requires serious planning and a cost of living that has been rising. But the social infrastructure that exists there, the networks, the knowledge, the willingness to cooperate, is the thing money can't easily buy in a new location. Western North Carolina completes the list, and the specificity is intentional. Veterans aren't moving to North Carolina broadly. They're moving to its western mountain communities, where the Blue Ridge Escarpment and the Black Mountains create a dramatically defensible and naturally productive terrain pocket unlike anything else in the East. The French Broad River system provides water, the climate is genuinely mild, cold enough to preserve food naturally in winter, warm enough to grow through a long season. The existing homesteading and back-to-the-land communities that established themselves in the 1970s and never left created a cultural baseline that makes grid-independent living normal rather than eccentric. Veterans who are arriving in places like Madison County or the hollows around the Nantahala are not the first wave. They are joining a conversation that has been going on for 50 years. The trade-off worth acknowledging is proximity to population pressure. Asheville is a fast-growing city, and surrounding counties are increasingly expensive as the region gets discovered. The window for affordable entry is narrowing for these exact reasons. Here's what ties all 9 of these places together, and it matters more than any individual geographic feature. In every single one of them, the human network is the actual fortress. Terrain without people who know how to use it is just scenery. Water without someone to manage distribution becomes a conflict point. Food production without community structure to protect it becomes an invitation to the desperate. The veterans who are quietly relocating understand this because their training was built on it. A fire team isn't effective because of the individual. It's effective because of the coordination, the trust, the shared understanding of how each person moves and what each person is responsible for. The grid-down communities that survive long-term won't be the ones with the most stored food or the most impressive gear. They will be the ones where, on the day everything stops, people already know their neighbors' names, already know who has medical training or can fix a generator or deliver a baby or identify the edible plants along the creek. The American grid will fail in some form, not because of pessimism, because of physics, economics, and the documented state of aging infrastructure that every relevant assessment has concluded is critically vulnerable. The question is not whether disruption is coming. The question is whether you are in a position where that disruption is manageable or catastrophic. A city of 3 million people without power for 18 months is not an emergency. It is an extinction event for a significant portion of that population. A community of 2,000 people in the Bitterroot Valley, with water from a river, food from established gardens and ranches, heat from woodlots managed for decades, and a cultural memory of self-sufficiency that never fully left, that community barely changes its daily life. The veterans who are moving are not running from the collapse. They are positioning themselves on the right side of it. They've spent careers studying how systems fail, how groups fracture under pressure, how terrain and logistics determine outcomes before the first shot is ever fired. And when they apply that training to domestic survival planning, they all arrive at the same conclusion. The fortress isn't in the city. It never was. The fortress is in the places where the land is generous, the community is coherent, and the infrastructure was never so complex that it became a liability. You don't have to be a veteran to understand this logic. You just have to be willing to think like one.